Unit 3. The Political Environment. Table of Contents. 1.0, Introduction. 2.0, Objectives. 3.0, Main Content. 3.1, Political Systems. 3.2, Government in Democratic States. 3.3, The Three Branches or Functions of Government. 4.0, Conclusion. 5.0, Summary. 1.0, Introduction. The political environment is an important dimension of the business environment, which affects business enterprise in a number of ways. In this unit, we shall discuss some of the key aspects of the political environment, which includes the political systems, government in democratic states, branches and functions of government, and how they impact on business activities. 2.0, Objectives. Having read this unit, you should be able to 1. Discuss the political systems, and how it affects business organizations. 2. Explain the functions of government, and its impact on business activities. 3. Demonstrate how political environment influences business environment. 4. Understand political systems. 3.0, Main Content. 3.1. The nature of the political system. The political environment is mainly concerned with the type of leadership a nation adopts. Political processes shape a society's laws, which constrain the activities of organizations, and thus create both opportunities and threats. Politics is concerned with those processes, which help to determine how conflicts are contained, modified, postponed, or settled, and as such, can be seen as a universal social activity. Politics tends to be associated with activities at state level, where the resolution of conflict often involves large numbers of people. 3.1.2, Government. This is concerned with the pursuit and exercise of power, the power to make decisions, which affect the lives of substantial numbers of people, be it at local, state, national, or even international level. Government may also refer the institutions, through which power tends to be formally and legitimately exercised, whether they are cabinets, parliaments, councils, committees, or congresses. Whereas, the pursuit and exercise of power tends to be an enduring feature of any society, governments are normally transitory, comprising those individuals and/or groups who, at a particular time, have the responsibility for controlling the state, including making laws for the good of society. How governments exercise their power, and the ideological foundations on which this is based, helps to indicate the nature of the political system, and its likely approaches to the resolution of conflicts. Worthington and Britton 2009. 3.1.3, Types of Political Systems. We can distinguish two main political systems, which are the authoritarian system and the democratic political system. However, in between these two, there could be other dimensions. 3.1.4, Authoritarian Political Systems. The authoritarian political system could be an individual, for example, a monarch, or other powerful individual, or a group of individuals, for example, a political party, or military junta who may have assumed political power in a variety of ways, by birth, election, or coup. Once in power, the individual or group will tend to act so as to limit the degree of participation by others in the process of decision-making, even to the extent of monopolizing the process altogether and permitting no opposition to occur. Where this is the case, a society is often described as being totalitarian. 3.2. Democratic Political Systems. In a democratic political system, it is assumed that as far as possible, conflicts should be resolved by rational discussions between the various parties concerned, with the final solution being accepted voluntarily by all participants, even if they disagree. In democratic setting, solution to conflict resolution can be achieved through a system of political representation and responsibility. In a democratic political system, the wishes and views of individuals are represented in established authorities that are chosen by the people at regular intervals through elections. Such representatives are accountable to the people they represent. According to Worthington and Britton, 2009, democracy means far more than just popular government or a system of regular elections. The democratic approach to government implies the existence of a complex array of institutions and processes, through which the wishes of the people are articulated and carried out. Although the specific institutional arrangements tend to vary between states, however, there are four common components inherent in any democratic government, which are an electoral system, a party system, a representative system, and a pressure group. These are discussed below. 3.2.1. The electoral system. The electoral system is responsible for organizing elections in the country. Thus, it is through the electoral system that the people, the electorate, are linked to the government through elections. Election gives the electorate the power to choose those who will represent them in the government. For an electoral system to be effective and operate in a way that will be regarded as democratic, Worthington and Britton, 2009, suggest that a country's electoral system should exhibit the following features. 1. A system of regular elections, for example, every 4 to 5 years, based on universal adult suffrage. In Nigeria, presently, elections are held for every 4 years. 2. Basic freedoms of speech, movement, assembly, etc. 3. Freedom from coercion, and absence of illegal electoral practices. 4. A secret ballot. 5. Free media. These conditions are necessary for a proper functioning of the electoral system. If they are absent, then the system becomes suspicious that the electoral outcome may not reflect the wishes of the people. Clearly, the electoral system must be transparent. Each vote must count, and the wishes of the majority, as expressed through the number of votes cast, are considered as the final result. In Nigeria, for example, a simple majority is usually sufficient to ensure victory. 3.2.2. The party system. In a true democratic dispensation, the system operates through the party system. Candidates are presented to the electorates through political parties. Although, it is also possible to have a one-party system, but in most countries like Nigeria, USA, and Britain, to mention just a few, different political parties are organized and the candidates are elected through the political parties. In the present Nigeria, there are various political parties, for example, PDP, APC, APGA, among others, which present their candidates for elections into different political offices at the local areas, state, and the federal levels. The parties, first of all, choose their candidates, and present them to the electorates for election into various offices. Thus, the candidates from different political parties compete for offices during election times. One of the major benefits of the party system is that it provides a means of selecting political leaders and the kind of policies they would pursue if they win the election. Parties usually use labels such as plants, animals, buildings, and other items to describe their parties to the electorates during election times, in order for voters to recognize their candidates and vote for them. In Nigeria, some parties use coin, hen, and umbrella, among others, to describe their parties to the electorates. In order to convince the electorate, parties usually have an identifiable policy statement, party manifesto, which states what the party stands to achieve or believe in, and attempts to achieve, if it gains political office. However, it should be noted that party manifestos are not always a good guide to determine preferences of individual candidates. What matters in most cases is the individual's credentials and previous achievements. 3.2.3. A representative assembly. An important feature of a democratic government is the existence of a representative decision-making body, which consists of a group of individuals, chosen by a country's citizens, to help make important decisions on their behalf. In Nigeria, which operates a federal system of government, we have such representatives at the local government areas, the states, and the national levels. Voters not only elect their own national government, but also choose decision-makers at the state and local levels. In most federal system of government as practiced by Nigeria, USA, and Britain, to mention just a few, the legitimate power to make decisions is divided between 2 or 3 levels of government, the national, state, and local levels. Each of these levels of government has independent powers that are usually laid down in written constitution, which is interpreted by the courts. For example, in Nigeria, the federal government controls armed forces and foreign affairs, while the state controls education in its state level. However, in contrast, under a unitary system of government, authority ultimately rests with the national government, and any powers granted to sub-national levels by central sovereign authority can ultimately be rescinded, including the right of government at sub-national level to exist. Worthington and Britton 2009. Thus, the government at national level clearly holds the whip at hand, and would normally expect its view to prevail, where a dispute over an issue or policy occurred, between it and a sub-national authority. It should be noted that decision-makers in democratic states at all levels, and under different government systems have on the whole, a tendency to settle such conflicts through negotiation, bargaining, and compromise, rather than by exerting their own power and authority, although this might be used on occasions. 3.3. Functions of government. There are 3 major branches or functions of government. These branches or functions of government are discussed below. 3.3.1. The executive function. Governing is not only about making decisions, it is also about ensuring that these decisions are put into effect, in order to achieve the government's objectives. Implementing governmental decisions is the responsibility of the executive branch of government. In modern states, the term, the executive, refer to the relatively small group of individuals, chosen to decide on policy, and oversee its implementation. Some of these individuals will hold political office, others will be career administrators and advisors, although some of the latter may also be political appointees. Together, they are part of a complex political and administrative structure, designed to carry out the essential work of government, and to ensure that those responsible for policy making and implementation are ultimately accountable for their actions. The policy-making aspect of the executive function is normally the responsibility of a small political executive, chosen wholly or in part by popular election. Under a presidential system of government, the chief executive or president is usually chosen by separate election for a given period of office and becomes both the nominal and political head of state. He or she subsequently appoints individuals to head the various government departments or ministries, which are responsible for shaping and implementing government policies. Neither the president nor the heads of departments normally sit in the legislative assembly, although there are sometimes exceptions to this rule, for example, the vice president in the United States. In contrast, in a parliamentary system, the roles of head of state and head of government are separated, with the former usually largely ceremonial, and carried out by either a president, for example, Germany, India, or a monarch, for example, UK, Japan. The head of government, for example, Prime Minister, while officially appointed by the head of state, is an elected politician, invariably the head of the party, victorious in a general election, or at least seen to be capable of forming a government, possibly in coalition with other parties. Once appointed, the head of government chooses other individuals to head the different government departments or ministries, and to be part of a collective decision-making body. For example, a cabinet, which meets to sanction policy proposals, put forward through a system of executive committees and subcommittees, for example, cabinet committees. These individuals, along with the head of government, are not only part of the executive machinery of the state, but also usually members of the legislative assembly, and both, individually, and, collectively, responsible to the legislature for the work of government. The day-to-day administration of government policy is largely carried out by non-elected government officials, sometimes referred to as civil servants or bureaucrats, who work for the most part in complex, bureaucratic organizations within the state bureaucracy. Apart from their role in implementing public policy, government officials help to advise ministers on the different policy options, and on the political and administrative aspects of particular courses of action. Needless to say, this gives them a potentially critical role in shaping government policy, a role which has been substantially enhanced over the years, by the practice of granting officials a significant degree of discretion in deciding on the details of particular policies and/or on how they should be administered. Whereas, politicians in the executive branch of government tend to be transitory figures, who come and go at the whim of the head of government, or of the electorate. Most, if not all, officials are permanent, professional appointees, who may serve a variety of governments, of different political complexions and preferences during a long career in public administration. Whatever government is in power, officials are generally expected to operate in a non-partisan, that is, neutral way, when advising their political masters and when overseeing the implementation of government policy. Their loyalty, in short, is to the current administration in office, a principle which helps to ensure a smooth transition of government, and to guarantee that the upheaval caused by a general election does not prevent the business of the state from being carried out as usual. 3.3.2. The judicial function. Governing is not just about making and implementing laws, it is also about ensuring that they are applied and enforced. The latter is essentially the role of the third arm of government, namely, the judiciary and the system of courts. Like political institutions, legal structures and processes tend to a degree to be country-specific and vary according to a number of influences, including history, culture, and politics. For example, while some states have a relatively unified legal system, others, organized on a federal basis, usually have a system of parallel courts, adjudicating on federal and state or provincial law, with a Supreme Court arbitrating in the event of a dispute. In some countries, a proportion of the judges may be directly or indirectly elected by the public, in others, they may be appointed by government, or co-opted by fellow judges. Business students should make themselves familiar with the legal arrangements within their own country, which contains information on the legal system in England and Wales. In this section, we look briefly at the judicial function, as related to the concept of democracy. Whereas, in totalitarian systems of government, the judiciary is essentially the servant of the ruling elite. For example, the party. In a democracy, it is an accepted principle that there should be a separation between the judicial function and the other two branches of government in order to protect the citizen from a too powerful state. This notion of an impartial and independent judiciary, free to challenge the government and to review its decisions, is regarded as one of the hallmarks of a democratic system of government, a further manifestation of the doctrine of the separation of powers. In practice, of course, notions of judicial independence and role within the democratic political process tend to be the subject of certain amount of debate, particularly in countries where senior appointments to the judiciary appear to be in the gift of politicians. For example, Supreme Court judges in the United States are nominated by the President with the consent of the Senate, or where individuals with judicial powers also have an executive and/or legislative role, for example, the Home Secretary in Britain. Equally, there are questions over the degree to which the courts should have the power to review the constitutionality of decisions made by a democratically elected government. In the United States, for example, the Supreme Court has a long-established right to declare a law void if it conflicts with its own interpretation of the American Constitution. In contrast, in Britain, the legal sovereignty of Parliament and the absence of a codified written constitution push the judiciary towards trying to interpret the intentions of the framers of government legislation, and any legal decision unwelcomed by the government can be reversed by further legislation. That said, it is interesting to note that in recent years, there has been an increased willingness on the part of the British judiciary to review administrative decisions, particularly those made by ministers. Worthington, in Britain, 2009. Other aspects too call into question how far in modern democratic states there is a total separation between the different arms of government, for example, increasing use of administrative courts or tribunals, and whether it makes sense to rigidly distinguish between rule-making and rule adjudication. Certainly, some of the past judgments by the United States Supreme Court, for example, in the area of civil rights, demonstrate that the courts can be influential in shaping decisions on major issues of policy, and suggest that the judiciary is susceptible to influences from their overall values or to general societal pressures. In short, it seems fair to suggest that under current legal arrangements, legal adjudication is not far removed from the world of politics. Arguably, we may like to perpetuate the myth of an entirely separate and independent judiciary, since this is a necessary aspect of the stability of many existing political systems. 3.3.4 Checks and balances in democracies. As will be evident from the analysis above, democracy implies the existence of a system of checks and balances, arrangements which serve to curb government action and restrict its influence on the day-to-day lives of its citizens. These restraints on the actions of the state at national level can be divided into two main types: political and social economic. Political checks and balances emanate primarily from three main sources. 1. The separation of powers, particularly the notion that the three arms of government are in separate hands, and that decisions require the concurrence of all branches of government. 2. A bicameral legislature, with legislation having to be accepted by both houses, and subject to scrutiny and amendment by opposition parties. 3. The territorial division of powers, whether under a federal arrangement or through the devolution of power to regional bodies and/or local authorities. Supranationalism is a further development. The point is not that these arrangements necessarily exist in their most complete form in democratic states, but that, however imperfect in practice, their existence helps to provide time for reflection and delay in the decision-making process, and to encourage consultation, negotiation and consensus building, the essence of the democratic approach to conflict resolution. The notion of social and economic checks and balances refers to those countervailing pressures on the activities of the state and its agencies that derive from the existence of non-state structures and processes, which affect the lives of individuals and which ultimately restrict the scope of government influence. These include private business organizations, professional associations, promotional bodies, churches, and other groups, which help to shape our economic, social, and moral environment. As subsequent chapters will demonstrate, the bulk of economic decisions in democratic states are not taken by the government, but by private individuals and organizations, that is, firms, interacting through a market system. This acts as a kind of check and balance on the free activity of the public sector, and is a fundamental characteristic of democratic government. It is appropriate to conclude this examination of the political environment with a brief discussion of the process of governmental decision-making in democratic systems. Here, the basic model of the organization in its environment, introduced in Module 1, serves as a useful analytical tool. Governments, like firms, are organizations which transform inputs into output, and they do so in an environment, largely the same as that which confronts other types of enterprise. Like other organizations, government is a user of resources, especially land, labor, capital, finance, and expertise, but in addition, all governments face political demands and supports when considering their policy options. As indicated above, political demands, including those directly or indirectly impinging on business activity, become translated into action through a variety of mechanisms, including the electoral system, party activity, pressure group, influence and political communication. Hence, a government is always keen to point out that electoral victory implies that it has a mandate for its policies. The supports of the political system are those customs, conventions, rules, assumptions, and sentiments which provide a basis for the existence of the political community and its constituent parts, and thus give legitimacy to the actions and existence of the incumbent government. In democratic systems, the belief in democratic principles, and the doctrines and practices emanating from that belief, are seen as central to the activities of government and its agencies. The outputs of the political system vary considerably and range from public goods and services, for example, healthcare, provided predominantly from money raised through taxation, to rules and regulations, for example, legislation, administrative procedures, directives, and transfer payments, that is, where the government acts as an allocator of resources, as in the case of the provision of state benefits. Taken together, the nature, range, and extent of government output not only tend to make government the single biggest business in a state, they also influence the environment in which other businesses operate and increasingly in which other governments make decisions. As far as governmental decision-making is concerned, this is clearly a highly complex process, which in practice does not replicate the simple sequence of events suggested by the model. Certainly, governments require means, inputs, to achieve ends, output, but the outputs of the political system normally only emerge after a complex, varied and ongoing process, involving a wide range of individuals, groups, and agencies. To add further confusion, those involved in the process tend to vary according to the decision under discussion, as well as over time, making analysis fraught with difficulties. One possible solution may be to distinguish between the early development of a policy proposal initiation and its subsequent formulation and implementation, in the hope that a discernible policy community can be identified at each stage. But even this approach involves a degree of guesswork and arbitrary decision-making, not least because of the difficulty of distinguishing precisely between the different stages of policy making and of discerning the influence of individuals and groups at each phase of the process. Notwithstanding these difficulties, it is important for students of business, and for businesses themselves to have some understanding of the structure of decision-making, and of the underlying values and beliefs which tend to shape governmental action, if they are to appreciate and possibly influence the political environment in which they exist. In short, studies of political systems, institutions, and processes help to provide insight into how and why government decisions are made, who is important in shaping those decisions, and how influence can be brought to bear on the decision-making process. As an increasing number of individuals and groups recognize, knowledge of this kind can prove a valuable organizational resource that on occasions is of no less significance than the other inputs into the productive process. 4.0 Conclusion. From the discussions above, it is clear that the actions and decisions of government affect business operations. It is imperative for managers and students to understand the workings of government and how decisions thereof affect business. Equally, effective strategies should be developed to influence, anticipate, and adapt to these decisions. 5.0 Summary. In this section, we have discussed the nature and importance of the political function and how it affects business organizations. We saw that the political system consists of the legislative organ which makes the law. The executive function implements the law, and the judiciary function is concerned with the interpretation, application, and enforcement of the law. These organs make, enforce, and implement decisions that could affect business organizations positively or negatively.